In December 1943, Allied armies clawed their way north through the mountains and mud of Italy, advancing yard by yard against an enemy that refused to break cleanly. Winter had settled over the front, slowing vehicles, stiffening rifles, and draining men already exhausted by months of grinding combat. It was here, far from capitals and conference tables, that a speech was delivered which would soon travel farther and faster than any armored column. The speaker was George S. Patton, addressing soldiers who had learned the cost of hesitation and the price of mercy in close country. He did not speak softly. He spoke of killing as necessity, of conquest as duty, of victory as something earned only through ruthless clarity. To the men standing in the cold, the words did not shock. They clarified. They named the violence already surrounding them and gave it a purpose. The speech was not classified. No stenographer recorded it. There was no official transcript stamped and filed, yet it refused to remain where it was spoken. Reporters caught phrases. Chaplains repeated lines in letters home. Junior officers paraphrased what they had heard as they moved between units and headquarters. Each retelling shaved context and added emphasis until the speech became less an address and more a rumor with momentum. By the time fragments reached Washington, the battlefield had vanished entirely. Sentences arrived alone, detached from mud, blood, and exhaustion. Read in offices far from the front. What had sounded like motivation to soldiers now appeared as something else, reckless, incendiary, politically dangerous. Words forged for men under fire were suddenly judged by those sworn to manage a democracy at war. The transformation was swift. Cables crossed the Atlantic asking for clarification before clarification could be gathered. Concern preceded comprehension. The speech had already become an object of scrutiny before anyone could say precisely what had been said or why. And as the first questions reached Allied headquarters, few yet understood that the true battle was no longer in Italy, but over how much truth a modern army could afford to speak aloud. By late 1943, Allied unity rested on more than shared objectives. It rested on restraint, patience, and a careful alignment between military necessity and political trust. The coalition fighting in Europe was not a single will, but a negotiated one held together by conference tables as much as by front lines. Victory depended not only on defeating Germany, but on preventing internal strain from hardening into division. The United States Army fought this global war under conditions no previous force had faced. It answered not just to generals, but to voters, legislators, editors, and allies who measured every action against democratic ideals. Civilian oversight was not an abstraction. It was constant, immediate, and unforgiving. In such an environment, battlefield success did not excuse public missteps. It amplified them. Words, once confined to campfires and command tents, now traveled freely. Newspapers carried quotes across oceans. Radios transmitted tone as easily as fact. Diplomatic cables relayed impressions as much as information. A general's speech could reach neutral embassies and enemy propagandists almost as quickly as it reached his own superiors. Language itself had become a strategic instrument. This placed military morale and political optics in permanent tension. Soldiers required clarity, sometimes brutal clarity, to endure prolonged violence. Civilian leaders required reassurance that the war was being fought within moral boundaries. What sustained one audience risked alienating the other. There was no stable middle ground, only constant adjustment. Patton's speech collided with a moment of particular sensitivity. The Italian campaign was costly and inconclusive. Allied cooperation required delicacy, not provocation. Any hint of indiscipline or extremism threatened to undermine the narrative of a measured, united force advancing together toward liberation. The fear spreading through headquarters was not of battlefield defeat. It was a fracture of trust eroding between allies who already remembered the tensions of earlier campaigns. A single voice, if judged unrestrained, could be taken as evidence of a broader problem. And because the voice belonged to George S. Patton, reaction preceded verification. His reputation arrived before the facts. Sharp, controversial, already watched his words were never neutral. What remained unclear was whether the danger lay in what had been said, or in how much patience the alliance still possessed for men who spoke without measuring the echo. Long before the speech reached Washington, the man behind it was already well known. George S. Patton had cultivated a public image that preceded his arrival wherever he went. Brilliant in maneuver, profane in language, uncompromising in expectation. He did not soften his edges for comfort, nor did he believe leadership required it. To Patton, war was not a forum for reassurance. It was a test that demanded honesty, however abrasive that honesty might be. Patton believed clarity saved lives. Ambiguity, he argued, bred hesitation, and hesitation invited death. His philosophy rejected euphemism. Violence, once chosen, had to be acknowledged plainly. In his mind, shielding soldiers from that truth was not mercy, it was betrayal. War demanded men who understood exactly what was being asked of them. His speeches reflected this belief. They were not oratory in the ceremonial sense. They were instruments sharpened deliberately to cut through fear and fatigue. Patton spoke in absolutes because he believed uncertainty was more dangerous than offense. He aimed not to inspire reflection, but action. To men already exposed to shell fire and loss, such bluntness often felt like respect. This particular address followed months of mounting frustration in Italy. Progress was slow, casualties persistent, and the enemy stubbornly entrenched. Patton had little patience for inertia. He saw morale wavering and resolved to confront it directly, using words as he used armor aggressively, decisively, without apology. The soldiers who listened did not hear the speech as citizens of a republic. They heard it as men under fire, standing in formation with mud on their boots and exhaustion in their faces. They understood the language instinctively. It named the reality they already lived. It stripped away pretense and replaced it with purpose. On the ground, the effect was immediate. The speech steadied nerves, hardened resolve, and reaffirmed Patton's authority. Applause followed, not theatrical, but genuine. In that moment, the words had done what Patton intended. They unified men around the grim work ahead. But speeches do not end where they are spoken. As the sound faded and units returned to their positions, the words began their second life detached from faces, terrain, and necessity. The applause died quickly. What remained was the echo, and it was only then that the speech began to cast a shadow Patton could not command. What reached Washington did not arrive as a speech. It arrived as fragments, selected lines, lifted from memory, paraphrased sentences carried across cables and corridors. Stripped of tone and circumstance, these excerpts moved quickly through offices where the war was understood in maps and memoranda, not in mud and exhaustion. By the time they reached senior desks, they no longer belonged to the battlefield at all. Civilian officials read the words in isolation. There were no formations before them, no wounded men listening in silence, no months of stalled progress weighing on every sentence. The language appeared stark, even aggressive, divorced from the conditions that had produced it. What soldiers had heard as candor, policymakers encountered as provocation. Concern followed swiftly. Questions surfaced about brutality and discipline, about whether such language reflected the values the United States claimed to defend. The war was being fought not only to defeat Germany, but to demonstrate moral distinction from it. Any suggestion that American commanders spoke too freely of killing threatened that carefully maintained contrast. Quiet comparisons began to surface, never formally stated, rarely written down. Yet the implication lingered in private conversations. Rhetoric mattered, and excess resembled the very enemy the Allies opposed. In a conflict defined as much by ideology as territory, words carried symbolic weight far beyond their immediate audience. From this perspective, George S. Patton no longer appeared solely as a battlefield asset. His effectiveness was acknowledged, but increasingly framed as volatile. A belief began to take hold that his presence created risk not of military failure, but of political embarrassment and diplomatic strain. In Washington, utility was being recalculated. Confidence in command restraint wavered. If a senior general could speak so openly, critics wondered, what limits remained? The concern was less about one speech than about precedent. Once uttered, such language could not be contained. It could be quoted, misquoted, and exploited by allies, by opponents, and by the press. The machinery of response began to move almost automatically. Requests for clarification were drafted. Internal discussions hardened into informal judgments. The process was not yet punitive, but it was unmistakably investigative. The system sought reassurance that control still existed, that commanders understood the boundaries imposed by civilian authority. Yet, even as scrutiny intensified, no definitive account of the speech existed. There was no transcript to analyze, no recording to contextualize. Judgment advanced ahead of evidence, shaped by reputation and anxiety rather than certainty. And, as Washington prepared to act, one critical question remained unanswered. Were they reacting to what had been said, or to what they feared it revealed about the men fighting the war on their behalf? Across the Atlantic, British commanders did not receive the speech itself. They received summaries, filtered, abbreviated, and already interpreted by the time they arrived. These second-hand accounts moved through staff channels and personal conversations, often framed by caution rather than curiosity. What mattered was not the full content, but the impression it created. For British officers, the name attached to the speech carried history. Memories of earlier controversies resurfaced quietly, recalled not as isolated incidents but as part of a pattern. George S. Patton was admired for speed and aggression, but also regarded as unpredictable. His reputation, sharpened by rumor and precedent, colored every retelling before any judgment was formally made. Trust within the Allied command structure was never assumed, it was maintained deliberately. Every joint operation required confidence that partners would act within agreed limits. The speech, as described, tightened that trust under strain. If one commander appeared willing to disregard tone and restraint, others wondered how far such independence extended. The underlying fear was not Patton alone. It was American unpredictability. British planners worried less about a single general than about what his words suggested regarding broader command culture. Could political pressure at home force sudden changes in leadership? Could public controversy disrupt operational continuity? These questions lingered beneath official reassurances. Diplomacy began to influence military calculation in subtle ways. Decisions that might once have been purely tactical were now weighed against their symbolic impact. Assignments, visibility, and authority were discussed with an ear tuned to perception. The alliance was fighting a common enemy, but it remained a coalition of sovereign interests, each sensitive to missteps. Unity increasingly appeared dependent on tone as much as tactics. It was no longer enough to advance together. Leaders had to sound aligned as well. Language became a measure of reliability. Restraint signaled stability. Excess invited doubt. In this environment, even silence carried meaning. Some commanders chose to say nothing at all. Silence avoided escalation, but it also bred uncertainty. Without clarification, speculation filled the void. Each unspoken concern hardened quietly, untested by open discussion. The absence of response became its own signal. By the end of the week, the speech had achieved something no enemy action had managed. It had unsettled the alliance without firing a shot. British leaders listened closely, not for what was said next, but for what would be done. And as they waited, one question remained unresolved. In a war fought by many nations, how much individual voice could the alliance afford before unity itself began to fracture? Before any official message reached him, George S. Patton sensed the shift. Rumors moved faster than orders. Staff officers spoke more carefully. Conversations ended sooner than usual. Somewhere beyond the Italian front, his words were being discussed by men who had not heard them spoken. Patton understood enough to know that trouble was forming, even if its shape was still unclear. When the substance of the concern became apparent, his reaction was immediate and firm. He refused to recant the core of what he had said. To Patton, the speech required no apology because it required no reinterpretation. It described war as he understood it: violent, unforgiving, and decisive. Anything less, in his view, risked dishonesty toward the men expected to fight it. He believed the speech reflected combat reality, not political abstraction. Soldiers were already killing and being killed. Naming that fact openly did not create brutality. It acknowledged it. To soften the language, Patton believed, was to pretend that war could be conducted without cost or moral burden. He saw such pretense as dangerous. What Patton misjudged was the battlefield he had entered unknowingly. The political arena operated by different rules, governed by perception rather than immediacy. There, context was fragile, and symbols mattered more than intent. Words were not weighed against conditions, but against ideals. Patton, who mastered maneuver and momentum, underestimated how quickly narrative could outrun fact. As criticism mounted, his belief in blunt truth hardened rather than softened. He viewed the backlash as evidence of distance between those who fought and those who governed. The farther one stood from the front, he believed, the less tolerance one had for candor. This conviction reinforced his certainty rather than challenging it. Advisors urged caution. Some suggested clarification. Others hinted that silence might diffuse the issue. Patton listened, but he did not yield. To retreat rhetorically felt, to him, like retreating morally. He feared that compromise would dilute authority, not only in his own command, but across the army. Leadership, once softened, was difficult to restore. With each passing day, the gap widened between battlefield logic and civilian expectation. What seemed self-evident to Patton appeared reckless to others. Neither side believed itself unreasonable. Each operated within its own framework of responsibility. By refusing to adapt his language, Patton preserved his internal consistency, but at a cost. The certainty that had served him so well in combat now isolated him from those who measured war by consequence rather than necessity. And as the distance grew, one truth became unavoidable. Patton was no longer being judged for what he did on the battlefield, but for what his words suggested about the kind of war America believed it was fighting. By 1943, war had acquired a second front, one without trenches or artillery. It unfolded across newspapers, radio broadcasts, and diplomatic briefings, where perception could influence strategy as surely as terrain. Victory still required firepower, but it also demanded coherence in how that power was described. Modern war had become, in part, a performance observed by millions far from the fighting. The United States Army struggled to adapt to this reality. Its leaders understood the need to sustain morale at the front while preserving legitimacy at home. Yet the balance proved elusive. Encouragement spoken to soldiers could appear excessive when printed for civilians. Discipline demanded control, but control risked sounding hollow to men risking their lives daily. The Army found itself attempting to speak to incompatible audiences with the same voice. Gradually, commanders learned that words were weapons. A phrase could stiffen, resolve, or invite scrutiny. A sentence could reassure allies or alarm them. Unlike artillery, language could not be recalibrated once fired. It traveled instantly, detached from the intent of the speaker, shaped by the fears and expectations of the listener. This realization clashed directly with the leadership style of George S. Patton. Patton rejected scripted leadership on principle. He believed authenticity mattered more than approval, that men sensed hesitation immediately. To him, rehearsed language signaled doubt. He preferred certainty, even if it offended, to caution that diluted command. Within the Army, debate intensified. Military psychologists were consulted to examine motivation under sustained combat. Some argued that blunt honesty strengthened resilience, grounding soldiers in reality rather than illusion. Others warned that unrestrained rhetoric risked normalizing excess, eroding the moral boundaries that distinguished Allied forces from their enemies. The question was no longer theoretical, it had consequences. Patton's speech became a case study in unintended impact. On the battlefield, it achieved its goal. It energized troops and reaffirmed authority. Off the battlefield, it unsettled allies and triggered political alarm. The same words produced opposite effects depending on where they were heard. The Army had not anticipated this divergence, nor had it developed tools to manage it. Innovation lagged behind necessity. Tactics evolved rapidly, new formations, combined arms coordination, adaptive logistics. Language did not. Commanders were trained to maneuver divisions, not narratives. There was no doctrine for tone, no manual for balancing candor with restraint. Each incident forced improvisation, often after damage had already occurred. As scrutiny increased, leaders began to speak more carefully. Some adopted neutral phrasing, others deferred entirely to prepared statements. The result was consistency, but also distance. Soldiers sensed the shift. Speeches grew safer, but thinner. Motivation became measured, calculated, and less personal. The Army found itself preserving cohesion at the expense of immediacy. The rawness of earlier leadership gave way to a managed style better suited to press releases than foxholes. Something was gained: predictability, reassurance, diplomatic stability. Something else receded: directness, trust, born of shared risk. Patton stood increasingly apart from this evolution. His instincts belonged to an earlier model of command, where proximity justified bluntness and results excused tone. The institution was moving in another direction, whether he agreed or not. The speech had revealed a gap not yet resolved between how wars were fought and how they were explained. And until that gap was bridged, every word spoken by a commander would carry the potential to help or to harm far beyond the front lines. The investigation began without a document. No transcript existed to anchor discussion, no recording to replay. What the Army attempted instead was reconstruction, assembling the speech from memory, marginal notes, and secondhand recollections gathered from those who had heard it or heard about it. Each account carried certainty, and each differed in emphasis. The speech had already become plural. Officers were interviewed quietly. Chaplains described tone more than content. Reporters recalled phrases that had struck them as memorable. Junior commanders repeated what they believed mattered most. In the absence of a fixed text, memory became evidence, and memory proved unreliable. What one listener remembered as motivation, another recalled as excess. Context shifted with perspective. No single authoritative version emerged. Instead, there were competing interpretations shaped by position and priority. Those closest to the front emphasized necessity. Those closer to Washington emphasized restraint. Each reading was sincere, yet none could claim completeness. The speech existed now less as an event than as an argument. Political pressure hastened the process. The longer uncertainty persisted, the greater the risk that indecision itself would become a liability. Questions were being asked in civilian offices and Allied headquarters. Silence invited speculation. The Army needed resolution, not necessarily truth, but closure. Conclusions accelerated accordingly. In these discussions, George S. Patton was never evaluated in isolation. His prior incidents surfaced repeatedly, folded into the assessment as context rather than evidence. Past controversies blurred into the present one, reinforcing a narrative already familiar to decision-makers. Pattern began to outweigh particulars. The review shifted subtly from what had been said to what it suggested about Patton himself. Was this an anomaly or confirmation? Did the speech reveal momentary frustration or enduring disregard for restraint? These questions mattered more than exact phrasing. Judgment coalesced around character as much as conduct. Fairness yielded gradually to expediency. The Army did not declare the process unjust, but it allowed urgency to shape outcome. Precision was sacrificed for speed. Ambiguity was resolved by assumption. In wartime, delay carried its own costs, and leadership chose decisiveness over deliberation. Behind closed doors, the institution confronted a familiar dilemma. Patton represented undeniable talent, speed, aggression, results. He also represented disruption. In a coalition war under public scrutiny, tranquility had strategic value. Stability reassured allies. Predictability calmed civilians. Talent, when volatile, complicated both. The choice was not framed as punishment or exoneration. It was framed as management. How could the Army preserve Patton's battlefield effectiveness while limiting his potential to unsettle the alliance? The solution would require compromise, protecting the institution even if it constrained the individual. As recommendations took shape, one fact remained unresolved. No one could say with certainty exactly what Patton had said, or how much of the outrage rested on interpretation rather than reality. Yet certainty was no longer required. The machinery of decision had moved beyond evidence. The review concluded not with clarity, but with direction. The Army had chosen a path that promised calm over candor, cohesion over confrontation. Whether that choice strengthened the force or merely postponed conflict was a question left unanswered. And as the decision awaited implementation, the Army stood at a quiet crossroads, forced to decide how much brilliance it was willing to contain in order to keep the peace it needed to fight the war. On the ground, reaction to the speech was largely uncomplicated. Soldiers defended it not out of loyalty to a general, but out of recognition. They heard in it an honesty that matched their experience, an unvarnished acknowledgement of what combat required and what survival demanded. To them, the language did not incite violence. It named it. In foxholes and bivouacs, the controversy felt distant, almost abstract. Many soldiers argued that morale depended on being spoken to plainly. Euphemism, they believed, belonged to men who did not have to advance under fire. The speech affirmed their reality rather than disguising it. It treated them as participants in war, not symbols within it. That distinction mattered deeply to men who measured leadership by shared risk rather than public tone. Officers, however, heard something else. Some worried less about the speech itself than about what it might permit in the future. If such language went unchecked, where would the boundary be drawn? Precedent mattered. Armies function on discipline as much as courage, and discipline depends on limits understood by all ranks. What inspired one unit might unsettle another. Among senior commanders, the concern was institutional. They had to consider not only morale, but coherence across units, services, and allies. A standard had to exist that could be applied consistently. Without it, authority fragmented. The speech forced them to confront whether effectiveness could be separated from restraint, or whether the two were inseparable in a coalition war. Civilian leaders focused elsewhere. Headlines mattered. Public confidence mattered. They understood that wars were sustained by consent as much as by firepower. The speech, as reported, threatened to complicate that consent. Voters far from the front did not require brutal clarity. They required reassurance that the war was being fought within acceptable bounds. This divergence exposed competing definitions of leadership. For soldiers, leadership meant truth under pressure. For officers, it meant balance. For civilians, it meant control. Each definition was defensible within its own context, yet none aligned perfectly with the others. The speech sat at the fault line between these expectations. At its core, the conflict reflected a deeper tension. War demanded violence, organized, deliberate, and often lethal. Democracy demanded restraint, moral, rhetorical, and institutional. The United States claimed to fight for both. Reconciling those demands had always been difficult. The speech simply made the contradiction visible. Attempts at compromise proved unsatisfying. Softening the language risked alienating troops who valued candor. Endorsing it risked alarming allies and civilians who feared excess. Clarification invited further scrutiny. Silence invited speculation. Every option carried cost, and none resolved the underlying disagreement. As debate widened, the issue escaped the confines of one general's conduct. It became a question of how a democratic army should speak about violence at all. What language was permissible when killing was unavoidable? How much truth could be voiced without eroding legitimacy? These were not questions Patton alone could answer. Within this widening debate, George S. Patton became a symbol rather than a subject. His speech was no longer evaluated solely on its merits, but on what it represented: a collision between necessity and image, between battlefield reality and political expectation. The Army found itself adjudicating not just discipline but identity. Was it an instrument that spoke plainly because it fought plainly? Or was it an institution that filtered its voice to preserve unity and trust? The answer would shape more than Patton's fate. By the time arguments reached their peak, the speech had receded into the background. What remained was the unresolved question it had raised about how wars are fought and how they are explained. And as leaders searched for resolution, it became clear that whatever decision came next would set a precedent extending far beyond one man, one speech, or one moment in Italy. Behind closed doors, the debate over Patton's future unfolded without ceremony. There were no raised voices, no theatrical confrontations, only careful language and measured pauses. High command understood the weight of the moment. This was not merely a personnel issue. It was a test of how the Army balanced performance against perception, results against restraint. Senior officers reviewed assessments that said little about the speech itself and much about its consequences. They weighed reports from the front against cables from Washington and London. The discussions circled the same dilemma repeatedly. Patton was effective, undeniably so. He drove momentum where others stalled. Yet his presence now carried a cost that could not be quantified in divisions or casualties alone. Allied leaders were consulted discreetly. Unity mattered more than pride. British commanders, still wary, watched closely for signals of American intent. Would Washington rein in its most volatile general, or would it accept friction as the price of aggression? The answer would shape trust moving forward. Effectiveness won battles. Unity won wars. Removal posed its own dangers. Soldiers admired Patton's clarity and energy. Stripping him of command outright risked damaging morale at a moment when endurance mattered more than inspiration. It could suggest that results were secondary to appearances. Yet retention, without visible response, risked scandal fuel for critics who already questioned civilian control over the military. Timing narrowed the options. Upcoming operations demanded stability. Changes in leadership could not disrupt planning or execution. The Army needed continuity, but also reassurance. Any decision would have to thread a narrow path between disruption and discipline. The solution that emerged was careful, almost surgical. The decision had to appear decisive, signaling control, while remaining controlled enough to preserve capability. It would not be framed as punishment, nor as vindication. It would be presented as adjustment, a recalibration of roles, rather than a verdict on character. Throughout this period, George S. Patton waited. Outwardly, he remained calm. He attended briefings, reviewed maps, maintained routine. Those close to him noted little change in demeanor. He had faced scrutiny before and trusted that results would speak louder than controversy. Yet the waiting itself was a form of judgment, and Patton understood that decisions made far from the front could shape his future more decisively than any battle. When word finally came, it was neither dramatic nor final. Patton would not be removed from the war. His talents were too valuable, his experience too deep. But his visibility would be reduced. His role would change. He would be repositioned present, but contained, active, but quieter. The verdict reshaped his career without ending it. It preserved the Army's claim to discipline while avoiding the shock of outright dismissal. Allies interpreted the move as reassurance. Civilians saw evidence of control. Soldiers sensed the political hand-guiding command decisions, even if the details remained opaque. The Army had chosen containment over confrontation. It had avoided collapse, but at the cost of ambiguity. Patton remained a weapon in reserve, not yet discarded, but no longer free to strike openly. The decision settled the immediate crisis, but it resolved little beneath the surface. Questions lingered about how much truth could be spoken, and by whom. The compromise held, but it was fragile, dependent on silence as much as agreement. As Patton stepped into his altered role, the war moved on without pause. Operations continued. Orders were issued. The machinery of conflict absorbed the decision and rolled forward. Yet beneath the routine, something fundamental had shifted. A line had been drawn not on a map, but in expectation. And in the quiet after the verdict, it became clear that the real consequences of the speech were only beginning to take shape. The adjustment took effect quietly. George S. Patton did not vanish from the war, but he receded from its public face. His movements were less visible, his voice less amplified. Press access diminished, public appearances narrowed. The change was subtle enough to avoid shock, yet clear enough to signal intent. Patton remained a commander, but no longer a symbol. The action was framed carefully. This was discipline, not disgrace. No formal rebuke was issued. No public condemnation followed. The Army avoided language that suggested failure or mistrust. Instead, it emphasized structure and responsibility, presenting the decision as routine management rather than corrective punishment. Authority, it implied, was being exercised calmly and proportionately. Allied leaders read the signal immediately. In London and other Allied capitals, the move was received as reassurance. It demonstrated that the American command understood coalition sensitivities and was willing to act to preserve harmony. The decision eased tension without reopening debate. It offered proof that civilian oversight remained intact, even over the most forceful personalities. On the front lines, the reaction was more complicated. Soldiers sensed the political hand-guiding command decisions, even if few understood the details. Patton's absence from public view did not go unnoticed. For some, it confirmed suspicions that success alone did not guarantee freedom of action. For others, it reinforced a growing awareness that war was being fought on multiple levels, only one of which involved rifles and maps. Unity held but narrowly. The immediate threat of fracture passed, replaced by a cautious equilibrium. Cooperation resumed without open dispute. Joint planning continued. The alliance moved forward, intact but more guarded. Trust was preserved, though it now rested on restraint rather than confidence. The speech itself faded from headlines. Journalists found new developments to report, new battles to analyze. Public attention shifted, as it always did in a long war. Yet the words did not disappear entirely. They lingered in memory, recalled in fragments, referenced obliquely, cited as an example rather than an event. The controversy settled into the background, unresolved but no longer urgent. Within the Army, the lesson endured. Officers spoke more carefully. Speeches were reviewed with greater scrutiny. Language was weighed for implication as much as intent. No directive announced this change. It emerged through observation and caution. Command culture adjusted not by decree, but by inference. The damage had been controlled, but not erased. Relationships strained by suspicion did not immediately return to ease. Patton's reputation remained double-edged, admired, and constrained in equal measure. The institution had absorbed the shock, but it carried the imprint of the impact. Containment had prevented collapse. That was its success. Yet containment also imposed limits. It narrowed acceptable behavior and reduced tolerance for deviation, even when effective. The Army had chosen stability over expression, cohesion over candor. As the war continued, the decision proved functional. Operations advanced. Alliances endured. The crisis did not repeat itself. From a strategic standpoint, the outcome could be called sound. But beneath the surface, a quiet recalibration had taken place. A boundary had been established, unwritten, but clearly felt around how truth could be spoken in uniform. The line was not drawn in anger, but it was drawn firmly. And as Patton operated within this new constraint, one truth became evident. The speech had not been silenced by containment. It had been absorbed, its meaning altered, its consequences extended, shaping a command culture that would outlast the moment that created it. The war did not pause for clarification. Operations continued as planned. Orders issued and executed with the same urgency as before. Maps were updated, units repositioned, objectives reassigned. On the surface, nothing appeared altered by the controversy that had briefly threatened Allied cohesion. The machinery of war absorbed the disturbance and moved forward, indifferent to unresolved questions. Patton was reassigned without ceremony. His new role carried responsibility but little visibility, authority without prominence. It was not exile, but it was not command in the fullest sense. He waited professionally, outwardly composed for an opportunity to reassert his value where it mattered most. Redemption, if it came, would not be announced. It would have to be earned quietly. For senior leadership, the episode left an uneasy residue. They had learned caution, but not clarity. No definitive standard had been articulated, no doctrine published to explain where boundaries lay. Instead, commanders inferred limits from outcome. They understood what had gone wrong, but not precisely why. The lesson was absorbed through consequence rather than instruction. Among soldiers, the message traveled differently. They saw a respected general curtailed without public explanation. Few debated the details. Fewer still expected transparency. War rarely offered explanations to those who fought it. The lesson was absorbed silently. Words carried weight beyond intention, and success did not insulate one from scrutiny. Leadership, they learned, was judged in places they would never see. The Army adapted but reluctantly. Adjustments were incremental rather than announced. Speeches became shorter, less vivid. Briefings emphasized objectives over emotion. Candor gave way to calibration. This was not imposed by regulation, but by observation. Officers watched what happened to Patton and adjusted their own conduct accordingly. Words were weighed more carefully than ever before. Not for accuracy alone, but for implication. Language was filtered through multiple audiences, troops, civilians, allies, each with different expectations and tolerances. The result was a quieter command voice, one that favored precision over passion and restraint over emphasis. This shift marked a turning point in command culture. It did not eliminate blunt leaders, nor did it prevent future controversy, but it changed the baseline. The Army became more self-aware, more attuned to the political dimensions of speech. War was no longer fought solely with weapons and plans. It was narrated in real time, and that narration carried consequence. For George S. Patton, the change was personal as well as institutional. His instinct remained unchanged, but his environment had shifted. The space in which he could speak freely had narrowed. Authority still rested in his hands, but expression was constrained by forces beyond his control. The absence of explanation left room for interpretation. Some saw the episode as necessary discipline. Others viewed it as caution taken too far. Most simply moved on, focused on the next objective, the next advance, the next survival. War rewarded attention forward, not reflection. Yet the effects lingered. The controversy had reshaped expectations without resolving debate. It had taught restraint without articulating principle. The Army functioned, adapted, and endured, but with a new awareness of its own voice. As campaigns unfolded and victories accumulated, the speech receded further into history, but the silence surrounding it spoke just as loudly. It signaled a shift from spontaneity to management, from raw truth to measured communication. And in that quiet adjustment, a new norm settled, in one that would define how commanders spoke and how much of war they were permitted to describe, long after the guns fell silent. With time and distance, the episode revealed how narrow the margin truly was. Later assessments showed that cooperation among partners in late 1943 had come closer to strain than official records ever suggested. Events continued, progress followed, and the controversy faded. But the conditions that produced it had been real, and the risks immediate. What appeared contained had, for a moment, been unstable. Large-scale cooperation depended on perception as much as performance. Forces could move in parallel, but confidence developed more slowly. Every major effort required trust that partners would act consistently, not only in action, but in how they presented themselves to the wider public. The speech unsettled that confidence by revealing how differently necessity and restraint were interpreted across the group. In this light, the speech became symbolic. It was no longer simply a set of words delivered in a specific setting. It came to represent deeper tensions between urgency and caution, independence and coordination, national habits and collective discipline. The reaction it provoked reflected underlying fragility as much as the personality of the speaker. Individual brilliance, long celebrated in historical narratives, proved risky within a shared structure. Exceptional leaders could accelerate progress, but they could also unsettle confidence if they appeared unpredictable. The system required not only ability, but reliability. In such an environment, brilliance had to be guided, not merely admired. Gradually, systems began to outweigh personalities. Procedures, protocols, and shared expectations took precedence over individual style. This change was never formally announced, but it shaped decisions thereafter. Leadership became less about singular figures and more about institutional alignment. Reliability was favored over inspiration, coordination over charisma. Within this framework, prominent figures were reassessed with caution. Effectiveness was acknowledged, but carefully contextualized. Strength was recognized as valuable, but bounded. Achievements were emphasized in practical terms, while public expression was deliberately limited. The distinction was intentional. The structure endured by narrowing acceptable behavior. This was its compromise. It reduced uncertainty by limiting deviation, even when deviation had shown results. The cost was subtle but real. The range of permissible expression tightened. Leaders learned to speak within a defined register, calibrated for multiple audiences at once. This narrowing preserved cohesion, but it also imposed uniformity. Extremes were softened, both reckless and candid. Stability was chosen over openness, a trade considered worthwhile under global pressure. The decision was defensible. It was also revealing. What nearly disrupted the structure was not disagreement over direction or resources, but uncertainty over tone. The episode showed how quickly confidence could erode when language fell out of alignment. It demonstrated that collective efforts are sustained not only by shared objectives, but by shared restraint. In the years that followed, the episode was referenced quietly in professional circles, not as scandal, but as instruction. It illustrated the limits of individual autonomy within collective effort. It warned that effectiveness, when detached from perception, carried risks of its own. The structure endured. It adapted. It learned to contain what it could not fully resolve. Yet that endurance came with boundaries drawn tighter than before. Acceptable conduct came to be defined less by outcomes and more by reassurance. In that sense, the speech left an unintended legacy. It forced a reckoning with how modern coalitions function under strain. It showed that unity is not forged through action alone, but maintained through discipline of tone. The structure did not break, but it did bend, and in the form it took afterward, the imprint of that moment remained, quietly shaping how authority would be exercised and how much of it could safely be visible. In the years that followed, the divide between Patton's philosophy and emerging command norms became permanent. George S. Patton believed that truth, spoken plainly, forged resolve and saved lives. Modern command culture moved in another direction, shaped by coalition warfare, civilian oversight, and a media environment that magnified every utterance. The clash was not personal, it was structural. and it would not be resolved in Patton's favor. The Army responded not with public doctrine, but with institutional habit. Message discipline became embedded in practice. Speeches were reviewed. Briefings were aligned. Language was filtered through chains of approval that prioritized consistency over candor. The goal was not deception, but coordination, ensuring that what was said in one place would not undermine effort elsewhere. Control replaced spontaneity. In this environment, candor yielded to coordination. Commanders learned to express intent without vividness, necessity without bluntness. The tone of leadership shifted toward the measured and the neutral. Words were chosen less for their motivational power than for their resilience under scrutiny. The Army learned to speak in ways that traveled safely. Future generals absorbed the lesson indirectly. They studied campaigns and outcomes, but also observed which behaviors were rewarded and which were constrained. No lecture was required to explain the boundaries. Careers provided the instruction. Those who mastered alignment advanced. Those who did not were managed, sidelined, or reassigned. The memory of controversy served as quiet guidance. As a result, war became more managed and less raw, at least in how it was described. The violence remained, but its language softened. Sacrifice was honored in careful terms. Necessity was acknowledged without detail. The distance between experience and explanation widened. This distance reassured civilians and allies, but it also changed the relationship between leaders and those they commanded. Something vital was preserved by this shift. Unity endured more easily. Trust among allies stabilized. Civilian oversight was reinforced. The Army became more reliable in its public voice, less vulnerable to misinterpretation. In an age of instant communication, these gains mattered. They reduced friction and protected legitimacy. Something else was lost. The immediacy of shared truth diminished. Soldiers heard fewer words that mirrored their experience directly. Leadership became safer, but also more distant. The blunt acknowledgement of war's nature, once voiced openly, retreated into private conversations and personal reflection. The institution spoke with care, even when care felt thin. The true cost of the speech extended beyond 1943 because it reshaped how military truth would be handled thereafter. It established a precedent that effectiveness alone did not justify expression. It taught that words, once released, belonged to the public domain and would be judged accordingly. The Army accepted that reality and adapted to it. Patton's approach did not vanish entirely. Elements of it resurfaced in moments of crisis, in leaders who valued directness when stakes were unmistakable. But those moments were exceptions, not the rule. The baseline had shifted. Command language became a discipline in itself. In retrospect, the speech marked a hinge point. It revealed the limits of blunt truth in a democratic coalition war. It demonstrated that victory required not only force and planning, but also restraint in how force was described. The Army chose to institutionalize that restraint. The cost was not paid all at once. It accumulated over time, in quieter speeches, in cautious briefings, in the careful distance between leaders and the language of violence. Whether that cost was justified remains a matter of judgment. What is clear is that the speech changed more than a career. It changed expectations. It narrowed the space in which truth could be spoken openly by those entrusted with power. And long after the battles of Italy were concluded, the lesson endured, shaping how wars would be explained, even as they were still being fought. In time, George S. Patton returned to the war in the capacity the Army had always valued most. He was used as a battlefield asset, decisive, aggressive, effective, but no longer as a public voice. His presence was felt in operations rather than statements, in maneuver rather than message. The institution had learned how to employ his strengths while limiting his reach. The speech, however, did not fade with equal discretion. It was remembered more vividly than its circumstances. Context thinned as memory endured. What remained was not the mud of Italy or the fatigue of the men who listened, but the idea of the speech itself, shorthand for controversy, for excess, for the danger of speaking too freely in uniform. The words survived longer than the moment that produced them. In that survival, the scandal reshaped civil-military boundaries. It clarified where authority rested and how it was to be expressed. Civilian oversight asserted itself not through force, but through expectation. Generals would command armies, but their words would be measured against national values and alliance needs. Speech became a shared responsibility, not an individual prerogative. The episode reinforced a difficult truth. Victory required both truth and restraint. Truth without restraint risked fracture. Restraint without truth risked detachment. The balance was never stable, only managed. Patton had leaned heavily toward truth as he understood it. The system leaned toward restraint. Neither position was entirely wrong, and neither could stand alone. War, in the end, punished excess in all forms. Excessive caution could stall momentum. Excessive bluntness could undermine trust. The speech was not catastrophic because it revealed brutality, but because it revealed how fragile alignment could be when words moved faster than understanding. In a coalition war, excess, whether of violence, ego, or language, carried consequences. With distance, history judged the episode more quietly than those who lived through it. The outrage softened. The fear of fracture receded. Scholars and soldiers alike came to see the speech not as a singular transgression, but as a symptom of a broader transformation. Warfare had changed. Communication had outpaced command tradition. Leaders were learning in real time where new boundaries lay. Patton's career continued, marked by achievement and contradiction. His legacy remained complex, celebrated for results, constrained for expression. He was neither silenced nor vindicated entirely. Instead, he became emblematic of a transitional moment, when old instincts collided with modern realities. The alliance, for its part, endured. It adjusted, narrowed its tolerances, and moved forward. The near fracture passed into memory, but the lesson remained embedded. Words could rally armies, but they could also unsettle partners. Language, like force, required discipline. What the episode ultimately revealed was not the danger of speech itself, but the power it had acquired. In earlier wars, words faded quickly. In this one, they traveled instantly, multiplied, and endured. They became weapons capable of shaping outcomes far from the front. They believed words could not divide an alliance built for war, until one nearly did.